Every show has characters inspired by real people. What makes Family Guy different is that at least 6 of its characters weren't created out of admiration or observation. They were based on people Seth genuinely disliked. Seth MacFarlane used a primetime animated show watched by millions of people to quietly destroy the reputations of people who wronged him. His high school bully, a network executive who almost cancelled the show, a college professor, a former colleague. He didn't confront them, he just turned them into characters in the show. And when some of those real people eventually found out, the stories that followed are genuinely wild. Before Family Guy became one of the biggest animated shows on television, Seth MacFarlane was just a kid growing up in Kent, Connecticut. His parents worked at Kent School, a private boarding school filled with wealthy students. Seth attended as a day student, but he never really fit in. While many of the other kids were focused on sports and school traditions, Seth spent his time drawing cartoons and dreaming about animation. After graduating in 1991, he went to the Rhode Island School of Design and later moved to Hollywood. There, he created a short animated pilot that caught the attention of Fox. That pilot eventually became Family Guy. But the show's success did not happen overnight. In 2002, after only 3 seasons, Fox cancelled Family Guy. Many fans believe the network never fully supported the show and constantly moved it around the schedule. For a while, it looked like the show was finished. Then, something unexpected happened. DVD sales exploded. Reruns became hugely popular. Fans demanded more episodes. And in 2005, Fox brought Family Guy back from the dead. It became one of the most successful television revivals ever. By that point, Seth had spent years dealing with critics, executives, and people who doubted him. And like many writers, he sometimes used real-life experiences in his work. That's nothing unusual. Writers do it all the time. What made Seth different was the platform. He had a hit television show watched by millions of people every week. Over the years, fans started noticing something strange. Several Family Guy characters seemed suspiciously similar to people Seth knew in real life. Some were former bosses, some were teachers, some were critics. And according to interviews and reports, a few were based on people Seth genuinely disliked. These weren't one-time jokes. They became recurring characters seen by audiences all over the world. Characters that appeared again and again and again. And in some cases, the real people eventually discovered they had been turned into Family Guy characters. What happened next was sometimes funny, sometimes awkward, and sometimes completely unbelievable. These are the stories behind them. The bully Principal Shepard has been a fixture at James Woods High since the early seasons. His defining trait is his specific kind of incompetence, where authority replaces actual skill or fairness. He hides snobbery behind standards and treats cruelty as part of his job. He fails often, but never doubts himself, because he has never been forced to question his own power. Most of this falls on Meg and Chris. His bullying feels casual and routine, like administrative paperwork rather than personal hatred. He is not the most important character in Family Guy, but he is one of its most consistent targets. And that consistency matters when you know who he is believed to be based on. Richardson W. Shell served as headmaster of Kent School from 1981 to 2020, nearly 4 decades leading the institution where Seth's mother worked and where Seth spent his formative years as a day student on the outside of a culture he was technically inside. Shell was an Episcopal priest, a figure of considerable local authority, and by 1999 he had become something significantly more specific to the MacFarlane family. The man running a letter-writing campaign designed to destroy the show Seth had just created. He set up a group called Proud Sponsors USA and used it to contact Family Guy's advertisers one by one, telling them to pull their money from the show. Vanity Fair investigated and surfaced his involvement. The New York Times covered it. Shell eventually acknowledged his role. What made the campaign particularly pointed, beyond the obvious professional damage it was designed to cause, was that Shell had worked alongside Seth's mother for years and knew exactly whose family he was targeting when he picked up the pen. Perry MacFarlane resigned from Kent School in the period surrounding this campaign. The timeline and the circumstances made the personal dimension of what Shell had done impossible to ignore. Vanity Fair's 1999 investigation into the Kent School mystery remains the most detailed public accounting of Shell's campaign, naming him directly and tracing the letter-writing operation back to the school. The New York Times covered the story as part of broader reporting on the advertiser pressure Family Guy faced in its first season. Seth addressed it in interviews from that period, describing his reaction as genuine shock, not because a religious authority figure objected to the show's content, which he had anticipated, but because of who it was and what it cost his family specifically. DVD commentaries from the first 3 seasons contain layers of school authority satire that read differently once you know the context. The sustained mockery of institutional snobbery and incompetent leadership is not incidental background material. It is a through line. Shell's campaign backfired in the way most attempts to suppress popular culture backfire. It generated coverage that introduced the show to audiences who might not have found it otherwise, and it gave Seth a villain whose actions were documented in national publications rather than requiring any embellishment. The irony of a campaign designed to kill the show instead of helping to sustain it is the kind of thing Seth has never needed to comment on directly, because the record speaks clearly enough. No public statement from Shell has ever confirmed that he recognized himself in Principal Shepard, but the character existed, the timing was documented, and the satirical portrait has been running on national television for over 2 decades. For a man who spent nearly 4 decades as an institutional authority, that is a specific kind of consequence. There is something understandable about this. A former student responding to an authority figure who targeted his family using the only tool he had, comedy. Principal Shepard is not a nuanced portrait, but a long-running humiliation of someone who earned Seth's resentment by using power against students and his family. The question is whether it ever truly balances the score. The first person got a minor character and years of quiet jokes at his expense. The next one got something much worse. He was a critic who publicly trashed Family Guy when the show was struggling to survive. Seth never responded in an interview. He responded on television, and the character many fans believe was based on him ended up becoming far more famous than anything the critic ever wrote. The network executive. The network executive and the media critic in Family Guy are shown in a similar way. They are often wrong, confident, and quick to judge things they do not understand. Both act like they have good taste, but the show presents them as out of touch and stuck in their own opinions. They represent people in power who decide what gets made and what gets rejected, without really understanding the work. The message is simple. gatekeepers are not always smarter than creators. On screen, it looks like general satire, but behind it, there is also a personal reason for that anger. Ken Tucker was a television critic for Entertainment Weekly during the period when Family Guy premiered and fought for its survival. And his assessment of the show was not ambiguous. He called it vile swill, graded it a D in a national publication, named it the worst show of the 1999-2000 season, and leveled accusations of anti-Semitism and racism that followed the show through its early years and contributed to the atmosphere that made its cancellation easier to justify. Tucker was not a peripheral voice. Entertainment Weekly was the most widely read entertainment publication in the country, and its D grade in the show's first season carried weight with network executives. The 2002 cancellation had multiple causes, and Tucker alone did not cancel the show, but his sustained early hostility helped establish a critical framing that made Family Guy easier to dismiss during its fragile early run. At the same time, the show was building a large audience through DVD sales and syndication, exposing a gap between critical reception and viewer demand. Archived reviews and later commentary documented this trajectory. Tucker's coverage continued into the revival era and beyond, maintaining a position of skepticism that the show's ratings consistently contradicted, which gave Seth an ongoing target whose publicly documented opinions required no embellishment to make them look absurd. The feud was noted in industry coverage, and it contributed to Seth's public positioning as an underdog creator fighting institutional resistance, which served him considerably better than it served Tucker. The dynamic of a show that critics dismissed and audiences embraced is one of the most useful narratives available to a creator, and Family Guy fit it precisely, with Tucker's documented hostility providing the clearest possible illustration of the critical failure the narrative required. Tucker rarely addressed the specific portrayals directly, which may have been a calculated decision, since engaging with them would have required acknowledging that a show he had called vile swill was worth responding to at all. Whether Seth's response was justified depends on how seriously you take what nearly happened. Family Guy came close to ending in 2002, and early criticism helped shape the negative view around it. A D grade in a major magazine from a known critic mattered when the show was already at risk of being dropped by the network. What Seth created in response was a long-running satire of out-of-touch critics whose opinions lag behind audience taste. It has lasted far longer than the original reviews, even if it isn't a clear form of justice. So far, every story has been about outside targets. People who went after the show in public and left a clear trail of criticism for Seth to respond to. The headmaster had a history. The critic had a platform. Both gave him something direct to work with. But the next case is different. This one comes from inside the room. Someone Seth worked with, trusted, and sat next to for years. And what came out of that situation is not a clear villain, which is exactly why it stands out. The Personal Betrayal Season 8's Quagmire's dad introduced Lieutenant Commander Dan Quagmire, a decorated military veteran and Glenn's father, who arrives for a visit and reveals that he is planning gender reassignment surgery to become a woman named Ida. The surface reading of the episode is a family reconciliation story, a son confronting the gap between the father he knew and the person his father actually is, working through shock and discomfort towards something that resembles acceptance. Quagmire's reaction is not played as villainous. It is played as human, the specific kind of human that involves not knowing how to hold something you were not prepared for. What surrounds that emotional core is the full weight of Family Guy's comedic machinery. Brian sleeping with Ida without knowing who she is, discovering the truth, and vomiting extensively and repeatedly in a sequence that drew immediate and sustained criticism. Lois quietly discarding food. Jokes built around the transition that critics and advocacy groups identified as reducing a trans woman's identity to a series of punchlines. The episode is not a straightforward attack on its subject. It is something more complicated and in some ways more uncomfortable than that. A genuine attempt at emotional honesty filtered through a comedic approach that kept undercutting its own sincerity. Steve Callahan had been a Family Guy writer since the early seasons and was one of the people Seth trusted most in the room. The episode came from Callahan's own experience with a parent's transition, which Seth confirmed publicly when defending the episode against its critics, pointing to the personal source material as evidence that the intent was sympathetic rather than exploitative. What Seth described in those defenses was a piece of writing that came from somewhere real and painful, processed through the show's comedic language, in ways that did not always serve the emotional material underneath. What Seth has never fully detailed publicly is the internal fallout. The confrontation he referenced without completing, the relationship damage that followed an episode that aired someone's private family pain on national television with crude jokes attached, the cost of using the writer's room as a place to process something that did not belong only to the person processing it. The details remain private. The gap in Seth's public account of what happened is itself a kind of answer. Seth's own interviews defending the episode provide the clearest sourcing for the personal connection, with his direct reference to Callahan's experience as the episode's foundation appearing in multiple entertainment press accounts from the period surrounding the Season 8 broadcast. The episode's air date and the writer timeline are documented in Family Guy production records. GLAAD's formal response to the episode is archived and detailed, identifying specific scenes and jokes as harmful while acknowledging the episode's stated sympathetic intent. Seth's public comments on the episode span several years of interviews and have a quality that distinguishes them from his defenses of other controversial material. They are careful in a way his other dither critical and advocacy response was immediate and divided along lines that the episode itself seemed to anticipate, with some voices acknowledging the personal source material and others arguing that personal experience does not automatically make harmful execution acceptable. Fan response was similarly split, with longtime viewers defending the episode's emotional ambition and others finding the comedy surrounding the transition impossible to separate from the genuine attempt at sensitivity the show claimed to be making. Fences are not measured in a way that suggests he is aware of dimensions he is not fully addressing. The internal fallout has never been publicly documented in full. What is known is that Seth has referenced a confrontation without completing the account of it, which in the context of everything else in this video reads as the one entry where the cost of the creative decision landed somewhere Seth was not fully prepared for it to land. Outro Seth MacFarlane often turns real-life moments into long-running jokes in Family Guy, making the show deeper than it first looks. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe for more. Next week, we look at network censorship, changed episodes, and Seth's pushback. Don't miss it.